You might be wondering why regulating interchange fees is such a bad idea. After all, wouldn't reducing bank charges be good for everyone? Unfortunately, the reality doesn't work out that way. Let me explain. With a card-based payment system like Visa or MasterCard, there are 4 parties involved. There's you, the consumer, there's the retailer, there's your bank, and the retailer's bank. You pay fees to your bank in return for the credit card facility, and the merchant pays fees to their bank in return for the merchant facility. But every time you actually make a payment, there are extra costs involved, not just for the secure transfer of your money, but also to pay for your rewards points, your interest-free period, and your fraud protection. To pay for these per-transaction costs, a combination of merchant service charges and interchange fees are used. When you buy using a credit or debit card, you pay the merchant money for their goods or services. The merchant pays some of that money to the acquiring bank in the form of a merchant service charge, and then the acquiring bank pays some of that to the issuing bank as an interchange fee. This way, both banks involved are paid approximately the same amount of money for the transaction, ensuring a fair payment for their costs. Your bank uses that interchange fee to pay for the costs of the transaction and also to pay for your rewards program, interest-free period, and fraud protection. So what happens if the interchange fee is reduced, which is what the Reserve Bank of Australia are wanting to do? Simple. The issuing bank suffers a loss of revenue because the acquiring bank doesn't have to pass on as much money from the merchant. This has a number of flow-on effects, none of which are good for you. The issuing bank needs to make up for the loss of revenue, and they have a range of options to help them do that. They can reduce your credit card benefits and rewards program, they can increase fees, or they can increase their interest charges. Evidence from past regulation of interchange fees shows clearly that the banks just pass the buck on to the consumer, you and me, to pay for their reduced revenue. On the other side of the ledger, the acquiring bank has more revenue, which they can either keep or pass on to the merchants in the form of reduced merchant service charges. Unfortunately, small retailers are unlikely to benefit as much as big retailers are, because they are less valuable to the acquiring banks and therefore less able to negotiate for the savings to be passed on to them. But even if the savings are passed on in full to the merchants, there's little to no chance that the savings will be passed on by the merchants to you, the consumer. For example, the savings on a $10 transaction would be somewhere around 2 cents. So if something costs $9.99, do you really think a retailer is going to reduce their price to $9.97 thanks to the tiny savings they're making in their merchant service fees? If you believe that, then I've got a bridge to sell you. To make matters worse, smaller banks and credit unions would be badly hurt by the reforms, because these small banks tend to be the issuing banks far more than they are the acquiring banks, because their clients tend to be consumers rather than businesses. As a result, these reforms will heavily favour the big banks and make it even harder for community banks and credit unions to survive. So here's the truth. Reducing interchange fees will cause your bank to either cut your card benefits or increase your fees, or both, and you're unlikely to see any benefits at the other end in the form of reduced prices. It's all pain and no gain. Shoppers and merchants benefit from credit cards. Shoppers love the convenience, and for merchants, the cost of accepting credit card payments is actually cheaper than accepting cash, once you factor in all the costs of cash, including trips to the bank, the security systems required, and internal theft. The existing credit card system isn't perfect, but it does do a pretty good job of distributing the costs of the system out among all the parties that benefit. And it's a lot better than what we'll have if the RBA reduce interchange fees even further, because that will create a lopsided cost burden and the banks will just pass the buck to you, increasing your costs and subsidising big banks and big retailers at your expense. That's why the Australian Taxpayers Alliance are saying don't let them pass the buck. Go to www.don'tpassthebuck.com.au.